Exposing an image correctly is one of the first things you need to learn as a beginner filmmaker. Nothing screams amateur more than an overexposed or an underexposed image. But before we can understand how to expose, we first need to know what tools do we have to adjust exposure. Today we will break down the exposure triangle. At the end of the video you'll be able to use different techniques to get the correct exposure for your footage. When it comes to exposure, there are three settings in camera that we can change to make the image brighter or darker: the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO. But besides making the image brighter or darker, they also have an additional effect on the image. Let's take a look at all of them individually. First things first, there is a lot of wrong information online about the aperture. I myself didn't know the right information until recently. Now, most of the wrong information lies in the details and might be seen as a little bit nitpicky, but I try to be as accurate as possible when I present information, so bear with me. It might be a little confusing, so rewatch this part a couple of times until you get it. So what is an aperture? Aperture is the hole inside the barrel of the lens that can get bigger or smaller. A lot of filmmakers and photographers think that aperture is the mechanical device inside the barrel of the lens that opens up and closes when you change the aperture. However, this is not the case. Aperture is the hole that gets bigger or smaller, and the device that opens up or closes is called a diaphragm. When a diaphragm opens, it allows more light to pass through the aperture to the camera sensor to make the image brighter. When we speak about exposure in film, we use f-stops as a measurement unit. Some lenses are f2.8, others are f4, etc. Now the confusing thing is that the smaller the number, the bigger the opening. So if I set my aperture to f2.8, I have a much bigger opening than if I set it to f16, for example. So if we want the biggest opening, which allows more light to pass through the lens, we need to look for a lens with the smallest f number. Aside from letting the light pass through the lens, the aperture has also one other impact on the image. It impacts the depth of field. To be clear, the aperture doesn't impact the depth of field directly. It impacts the size of the entrance pupil, and the entrance pupil impacts the depth of field. The entrance pupil is the hole we can see if we look through the front element of the lens. Now, some of you might be thinking, wasn't that hole the aperture? And that's where it gets somewhat confusing. Let me explain. Inside the lens, the diaphragm can open or close to make a hole bigger or smaller. That hole is called the aperture. How we see that hole through the front of the lens, that is called the entrance pupil. When we are looking through the front of the lens, we are looking through glass. So the hole might appear bigger or smaller depending on the lens because it gets magnified by the glass we're looking through. So the size of the hole we see through the front of the lens is called the entrance pupil, and the actual size inside the lens is called the aperture. Basically, this means that you can set the same aperture on two different lenses, and while the hole inside the lens will be the same, how we see it through the front of the lens will be different. Yes, I know this is a little bit confusing. Gerald Undan has also made a video about this topic and he does a better job at explaining it than I do, so I will link his video in the description. So to wrap it up, the entrance pupil impacts the depth of field, and the aperture impacts the entrance pupil. So the bigger the aperture, the bigger the entrance pupil and the shallower the depth of field. So the aperture affects how bright or dark the image is, and it affects the depth of field. Luckily, is this one much easier to understand. The shutter speed dictates how long each frame you shoot is exposed for. You can think of it as a curtain that opens and closes up very fast. You can set the shutter speed anywhere from a small fraction of a second to a couple of seconds. For example, 1/1000th of a second means that the shutter speed will be open for a single millisecond, because a millisecond is 1,000th part of a second. On the other hand, it could be open for a whole second or even 2 seconds. The longer it stays open, the more light it lets through, which results in a brighter image. Shutter speed, however, also affects the motion blur. If the shutter speed is very fast, there is hardly any motion blur visible and we can freeze our subject in time. And if the shutter speed is very slow, there is a lot of motion blur and any small movement can look like it's a very fast movement. When we shoot video, we mostly stick to the 180-degree shutter rule. That means that we set our shutter speed to 2 times our frame rate. So if we shoot at 24 frames per second, we set our shutter speed to 1/48th of a second, or as close as we can get to it, like 1/50th of a second on my camera. Some cameras will not let you select the exact shutter speed you want, so just pick the closest to double your frame rate. If we stick to this rule, we will have the most natural motion blur possible. However, by sticking to it, we also limit ourselves in terms of adjusting our shutter speed while filming. Most of the time we want natural motion blur in our films, which means we will not be using shutter speed to adjust exposure, So that brings us to our last member of the exposure triangle. ISO is an artificial way to make our images brighter. It makes the sensor inside the camera more sensitive to light, which means it needs less light to see. By boosting the ISO, you can make the image brighter without affecting the depth of field or the motion blur. However, it comes with one disadvantage, and that disadvantage is the image quality loss. The more you increase the ISO, the more noise it introduces to your image, which in turn lowers the quality of your image. How far you can push the ISO depends on the camera. Some cameras are better at it than others. Every year the cameras get better and better, and with each new development we can push the ISO higher while keeping the noise levels acceptable. So now we know we can affect the brightness of our image by either changing the aperture, the ISO or the shutter speed. Now in terms of aperture, we have to take into account that it will affect our depth of field. Shutter speed we mostly leave alone because we don't want to affect the natural motion blur unless there is a specific reason for it. And then we have the ISO, which we can use in moderation. So basically this means that we only have the aperture and the ISO to expose with. Now in a perfect world, we would pick the aperture which is appropriate for the look we want to achieve. Then keep the ISO at the minimum and bring in lights to correct the exposure this way. However, we don't always operate in the perfect world, so in those cases I would say use the aperture and ISO for your exposure. First, you decide on an aperture. That decision should be based on the amount of depth of field you want in your shot. Then, if the image is still too dark, you can boost up the ISO. For that, you need to know what is the highest acceptable ISO on your camera. By acceptable, I mean that the image still looks good or decent. If the image is still too dark, however, you might have to open the aperture even more, and if you were already filming wide open, your only other options are to either bring in lighting, move to a different location with more available light, or use a different lens with a lower f number. On the other hand, if the image is too bright, first thing you need to do is to lower the ISO as much as possible. Then select the aperture that you want. If the image is still too bright, you can use an ND filter to lower the exposure even further. Now, if you don't have an ND filter, you can use a smaller aperture. If you don't want to use a smaller aperture and don't have an ND filter, in some cases, if there is not a lot of movement in the shot, you can use a faster shutter speed. However, I don't recommend it unless you really need that shallow depth of field. In my opinion, it is just better to use a smaller aperture. I hope I made it clear for you how the exposure triangle works. I still believe the best way to expose an image is by understanding how lighting works. For that, you can use my lighting cheat sheet. If you enjoyed the video, leave a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Till next time.